Every morning at 6:30 sharp, Margaret would unlock the heavy wooden doors of Clearwater Elementary School's library. The quiet hallways still smelled of fresh cleaning supplies, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating dancing patterns on the polished floor. This was her favorite time of day, when the library belonged only to her. She would walk slowly between the tall bookshelves, running her fingers along the colorful spines. Each book was like an old friend. She knew exactly where to find the adventure stories that made boys forget they didn't like reading. She could pick out the perfect fairy tale for a shy girl who needed courage. The mystery books that kept teenagers turning pages late into the night were arranged just so, waiting for the right young reader to discover them. Margaret had been doing this same morning routine for 37 years. When she first started working at the library, everything was different. There were no computers, no fancy cataloging systems, just thousands of books and her amazing memory. She could remember every single book that came and went. Parents would bring their grown children back to visit, and Margaret would still remember exactly which stories had captivated them decades ago. The children loved her storytelling sessions. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she would gather the younger students in the cozy reading corner she had created with soft cushions and warm lighting. Her voice would change for each character in the story. She became a growling bear, a squeaky mouse, or a wise old owl. The kids would sit with their mouths open, completely lost in whatever magical world she painted with her words. But Margaret was much more than just a storyteller. She understood that every child learned differently. Tommy might struggle with thick chapter books, but he could devour graphic novels about superheroes. Little Amy was too shy to ask questions in class, but she would whisper her curiosities to Margaret during lunch breaks. The quiet boy who sat alone at recess came alive when Margaret introduced him to books about space and planets. She created special programs that no computer could ever replace. The Reading Buddy system paired struggling readers with confident ones. Her mystery book club had kids solving puzzles and riddles while improving their comprehension skills. During the winter months, she organized cozy reading days where children could bring blankets and stuffed animals to make reading feel like a warm hug. The teachers respected Margaret's wisdom. Mrs. Peterson needed books for her unit on ocean life. Margaret didn't just hand over a stack of textbooks. She carefully selected picture books that would capture imaginations, fact books that matched different reading levels, and even poetry about the sea. She knew which resources would work for hands-on learners, and which would appeal to children who preferred quiet study. Margaret's influence stretched far beyond the school walls. She organized summer reading programs that kept kids engaged during vacation. She coordinated with the public library to make sure students always had access to books. When families couldn't afford to buy books, Margaret quietly made sure those children had stories to take home. Her small office behind the main desk was filled with thank you notes from students, drawings from kindergartners, and photos from school events spanning decades. She had watched first graders grow up, graduate high school, and return years later with their own children. Some had become teachers themselves, crediting Margaret with inspiring their love of learning. The library, under Margaret's care, was never just a place to store books. It was the beating heart of the school. It was where the lonely kids found friends between the pages of novels. It was where struggling students discovered they were actually quite smart, just different. It was where future writers, scientists, and dreamers first fell in love with knowledge. But by her 37th year, Margaret began noticing changes that worried her. New administrators arrived with big ideas about modernizing education. They talked constantly about tablets, digital resources, and automated systems. During staff meetings, Margaret would listen to presentations about artificial intelligence and online learning platforms. Younger teachers nodded enthusiastically, but Margaret felt a cold fear creeping into her heart. She tried to adapt. Margaret took computer courses on weekends, learning how to use the new digital catalog system. She attended workshops about educational technology, even though the fast-paced presentations left her feeling confused and overwhelmed. She watched as parts of her carefully curated library were boxed up to make room for charging stations and computer desks. The children still loved coming to the library, but Margaret noticed changes in them too. They seemed restless, always asking if they could use computers instead of books. Their attention spans seemed shorter. Some could navigate complex video games, but struggled to follow a simple story from beginning to end. Margaret refused to give up. She worked harder than ever, staying late to create displays that would compete with the flashy digital alternatives. She learned to use the smartboard and incorporated technology into her storytelling sessions. But despite all her efforts, she could feel something shifting in the school's atmosphere. The young administrator, who had been hired as director of digital learning, began visiting the library more frequently. She would walk around with a tablet, making notes and asking questions about efficiency metrics and resource optimization. Margaret tried to explain that education couldn't be measured only in numbers, that the real magic happened in quiet moments when a child's eyes lit up with understanding. But Margaret sensed that her words were falling on deaf ears. The district was changing, and she worried that there might not be room for someone like her in this new world. Still, every morning, she unlocked those heavy wooden doors with hope in her heart, believing that as long as there were children who needed stories, there would be a place for someone who knew how to tell them. The pink envelope was sitting on Margaret's desk when she arrived that Tuesday morning in March. She almost didn't notice it at first, busy as she was arranging a new display of spring-themed books for the younger children. But there it was, official and ominous, with her name typed across the front in cold, black letters. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She had to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words sank in. After 37 years of dedicated service, her position was being eliminated as part of the district's new digital transformation plan. She had 2 weeks to wrap up her duties and train her replacement. The letter was signed by Principal Johnson, a woman barely 30 years old, who had been hired just 6 months earlier. Margaret remembered when the principal was announced how the school board had praised her innovative ideas and fresh perspective. Now those same qualities were being used to push Margaret out the door. Margaret sank into her chair, the letter still clutched in her shaking hands. Around her, the library hummed with its usual morning energy. Books waited patiently on shelves, ready to transport young minds to distant worlds. The reading corner she had created with such love looked back at her accusingly, as if asking why she was abandoning it. The worst part came later that morning when Principal Johnson arrived for what she called a quick chat. The young woman perched on the edge of Margaret's desk, trying to look sympathetic while delivering what felt like a rehearsed speech. "Margaret, I want you to know this wasn't an easy decision," she began, her voice artificially sweet. "But we need to face reality. Today's students are digital natives. They need someone who can guide them through online databases, virtual reality experiences, and interactive learning platforms." Margaret tried to interrupt, to explain about the computer courses she had taken, the new skills she had learned. But Principal Johnson held up a perfectly manicured hand. "I know you've tried to adapt, and we appreciate that. But let's be honest. This generation of educators brings a natural understanding of technology that simply can't be taught to someone from your generation." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Someone from your generation. As if her decades of experience, her deep understanding of how children learn, her ability to match the perfect book to the right child at exactly the right moment meant nothing compared to knowing how to operate a tablet. "What about my reading programs?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The storytelling sessions? The children love them." Principal Johnson's smile never wavered, but her eyes showed a hint of impatience. "Oh, we'll be replacing all of that with much more efficient digital solutions. Interactive story apps, automated reading assessments, AI-powered recommendation systems. It's really quite exciting." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And my replacement? It's fantastic. It's fresh out of library school with a master's degree in information science. She's already developing plans for virtual book clubs and gamified learning experiences. The children are going to love it." That afternoon, Margaret met Crystal for the first time. The young woman bounced into the library wearing trendy glasses and carrying the latest tablet model. She spoke rapidly about clouds and algorithms and user engagement metrics. When Margaret tried to show her the carefully organized sections and explain how different types of books appeal to different personalities, Crystal barely looked up from her screen. "Oh, we won't need most of these physical books," Crystal said with a dismissive wave toward the shelves that represented Margaret's life's work. "Everything's going digital. It's much more space efficient, and the analytics we can gather on reading habits will be incredible." Margaret watched in horror as Crystal walked through the library like a general survey in conquered territory. The cozy reading nooks would be replaced with charging stations. Carefully curated displays would give way to interactive screens. The quiet corners where shy children found solace would become collaboration spaces with constant noise and activity. Over the next few days, word spread through the school about Margaret's departure. The reactions were heartbreaking and illuminating. Many of the older teachers stopped by to express their shock and sympathy, but they spoke in hushed tones, afraid their own jobs might be at risk if they protested too loudly. Some colleagues began avoiding Margaret altogether, as if her situation might be contagious. Others offered awkward condolences that felt more like eulogies. "You've had a good run," they would say, or maybe it's time to enjoy retirement, as if being forced out was somehow a gift rather than a devastating blow. The children's reactions were the hardest to bear. When 7-year-old Timmy heard that Margaret was leaving, he burst into tears right there in the library. "But who's going to do the funny voices when you read to us?" he sobbed. Margaret had no answer for him. 12-year-old Rebecca, who had been struggling with reading until Margaret introduced her to mystery novels, cornered Margaret by the biography section. "This isn't fair," she said with the fierce indignation only children can muster. "You're the best teacher in the whole school. Why are they making you leave?" Again, Margaret found herself speechless. How could she explain to a child that sometimes being good at your job isn't enough? That in a world obsessed with the newest and shiniest, experience and wisdom could become liabilities rather than assets? The final week was torture. Margaret had to watch as Crystal began dismantling everything she had built. Books that had found homes on Margaret's shelves for decades were boxed up for donation. The storytelling chair where she had brought countless tales to life was moved to storage. Even the hand-painted signs Margaret had created to help children navigate the library were taken down and replaced with sleek digital displays. On her last day, Margaret arrived early as she always had. But this time, instead of unlocking the doors with anticipation, she walked through the library saying goodbye to a lifetime of memories. She touched the spine of Charlotte's Web, the book that had made her fall in love with children's literature. She straightened the cushions in the reading corner one last time as she packed the last of her personal items into cardboard boxes. Margaret felt like she was attending her own funeral. 37 years of dedication, of late nights creating perfect lesson plans, but weekends spent at book fairs searching for treasures to share with her students. All reduced to a few boxes of memories and a form letter thanking her for her service. The hardest part wasn't leaving the building. It was knowing that tomorrow children would come looking for the magic she had created, only to find it had been replaced by something cold and efficient, something that could track their reading progress, but couldn't see the wonder in their eyes when they discovered a new favorite story. The first month of retirement felt like living in someone else's life. Margaret would wake up at 6:30 out of habit, then remember she had nowhere to go. No children waiting for story time. No teachers needing help finding the perfect book for their lesson plans. Just empty hours stretching ahead like an endless, quiet hallway. Her pension check was smaller than she had expected. After paying rent on her comfortable 2-bedroom apartment, buying groceries, and covering her medications, there was barely anything left. Margaret had always been careful with money, but she had never imagined how expensive it would be to simply exist without a steady income. The hardest decision came after 3 months, when her landlord raised the rent. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills and bank statements, doing the math over and over. No matter how she calculated it, the numbers didn't work. She would have to move. The apartment she found was in a part of town she had never visited before. The Sunset Manor complex sounded pleasant enough in the newspaper ad, but when Margaret arrived to look at it, her heart sank. The building was old and tired, with peeling paint and a parking lot full of potholes. The Garden View studio apartment was actually a basement unit that looked out onto a patch of weeds and a rusty dumpster. but it was what she could afford. Margaret signed the lease with a heavy heart, feeling like she was signing away the last bit of her dignity. Moving day was the loneliest day of Margaret's life. She had hired 2 teenage boys to help carry her boxes, and they worked quickly and quietly, probably wondering why this old lady had so many books. Margaret tried to explain that each box contained treasures, stories that had shaped young minds for decades, but the boys just nodded politely and kept loading the truck. Her new home was tiny and dark. The ceiling was low, and the single window barely let in any natural light. Margaret tried to arrange her beloved books on the few shelves available, but there simply wasn't enough space. Boxes of books had to stay packed, stacked against walls like silent accusations of a life that no longer had room for the things she loved most. The other residents of Sunset Manor were mostly elderly people who seemed to drift through the hallways. Like ghosts, Mrs. Chen from down the hall had been a nurse for 40 years before her hospital restructured her position away. Mr. Rodriguez had been a carpenter, until arthritis made him too slow for construction crews that valued speed over craftsmanship. They were all people who had once been valued, who had built careers and made contributions, only to find themselves discarded when the world decided they were no longer useful. Margaret tried to stay positive at first. She applied for part-time jobs at bookstores, thinking her love of literature would be an asset. But the young managers would look at her application, glance at her gray hair, politely explain that they were looking for someone with more energy or better technology skills. One particularly cruel manager told her they needed someone who could relate to younger customers. The public library seemed like a natural fit, but even there, Margaret faced rejection. The head librarian, a woman half Margaret's age, listened politely to her qualifications, but explained that they needed volunteers who could handle their new digital systems. When Margaret mentioned her recent computer training, the woman smiled condescendingly and said they really needed someone who was naturally tech-savvy. Even volunteer opportunities seemed closed to her. The literacy program at the community center said they had concerns about insurance liability with older volunteers. The after-school tutoring program wanted people who could connect with today's kids and suggested that Margaret might not understand modern teaching methods. Each rejection felt like another door slamming shut. Margaret began to believe what the world seemed to be telling her, that she was obsolete, a relic from a time that no longer mattered. She stopped applying for jobs, stopped leaving her apartment except for necessary errands. The depression crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. Margaret would spend entire days in her bathrobe, surrounded by the boxes of books she couldn't bear to unpack but had nowhere to display. She would pick up a familiar story, one she had shared with hundreds of children over the years, and wonder if anyone remembered those magical moments, or if they had all been forgotten as easily as she had been. Her sister Helen called every Sunday. Mum. But Margaret found herself lying about how she was doing. "Oh, I'm keeping busy," she would say, when the truth was that she barely moved from her chair most days. "Retirement is quite an adjustment," she would add with false cheer, and what she really meant was that she felt like she was disappearing. A little more each day. The worst moments came at night when Margaret would lie awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the city outside her tiny window. She would think about all the children she had helped over the years, wondering if any of them ever thought about the librarian who had introduced them to their first favorite book. Did little Timmy still remember the funny voices she used during story time? Had Rebecca continued reading mysteries? Were any of the lives she had touched better because of her influence? Sometimes Margaret would catch glimpses of her old school on the local news. The district was always announcing some new educational initiative or technology upgrade. She never saw any mention of reading scores or whether children were actually learning to love books. It seemed like everything had become about data and metrics and efficiency, with no room for the quiet magic that happened when a caring adult helped a child discover the joy of reading. Margaret's world grew smaller and smaller. The grocery store clerk who had once chatted with her about the weather now barely looked up when she checked out. Her mailbox filled with advertisements for retirement communities and medical alert systems, as if the world had decided she was just waiting around to get sick or die. The woman who had once filled a library with laughter and learning now felt invisible, forgotten, thrown away like an old book that no one wanted to read anymore. She had become exactly what the world had told her she was: outdated, irrelevant, taking up space that could be better used by someone younger and more modern, but deep inside, buried under layers of rejection and disappointment, a small flame still flickered. Margaret still knew things that mattered. She still understood how to reach a struggling reader, how to match the right story to the right child, how to make learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. She just needed someone to see that her light hadn't gone out, only dimmed from being ignored for so long. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when Margaret's world began to change, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. She was sitting on the weathered wooden bench outside Sunset Manor, holding a paperback copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins that she had rescued from one of her packed boxes. The autumn sun felt warm on her face, and for the first time in months, she had ventured outside just to read. Margaret had always believed that books should be shared, not hidden away in dark apartments. Ouch! So even though she felt foolish, she had started bringing a book outside each afternoon, reading on the bench where anyone walking by might see that stories still mattered to someone. David Rodriguez was having one of those days that single parents know all too well. His 8-year-old daughter Isabella had come home from school upset again. Her teacher had sent another note about her reading struggles, and the expensive tutoring service he had tried for 3 months wasn't helping. Isabella was falling further behind her classmates, and David could see her confidence crumbling a little more each day. He was walking Isabella to the small playground near Sunset Manor, hoping some fresh air might lift her spirits, when a bright red ball rolled away from the swings. Isabella chased after it, and it came to rest right beside the bench where Margaret was sitting. Margaret looked up from her book as the little girl approached. Isabella was clearly frustrated, her school backpack dragging behind her, her expression defeated in a way that no 8-year-old should ever look. "Is this your ball, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently, picking up the red sphere and offering it with a warm smile. Isabella nodded and mumbled a quiet thank you. But instead of running back to the playground, she lingered beside the bench. Her eyes had caught sight of the book in Margaret's hands. "What are you reading?" Isabella asked, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. Margaret's face lit up in a way it hadn't for months. "Oh, this is a wonderful story about a brave girl who lives all alone on an island. She has to figure out how to survive using only what nature provides. Would you like to hear a little bit about it?" David had been watching from the playground, ready to call Isabella back, but something about the gentle way this older woman spoke to his daughter made him pause. There was a kindness in her voice that reminded him of his own grandmother, and Isabella seemed more engaged than she had been in weeks. "Isabella, don't bother the nice lady," David called out, walking over to join them. "She's no bother at all," Margaret replied, and David could hear genuine warmth in her voice. "I was just telling her about this story." "Are you her father?" David nodded, extending his hand. "I'm David, and this is Isabella. We live just a few blocks away." "Margaret," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that spoke of years of confidence, even if that confidence had been shaken lately. "It's lovely to meet you both." Something in Margaret's manner made David pause. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a way of speaking that suggested education and experience. On impulse, he found himself asking, "Are you a teacher?" The light in Margaret's eyes dimmed slightly, and she was quiet for a moment before answering. "I was a librarian for many years, at an elementary school. But I'm retired now." The word retired didn't quite ring true to David's ears. Margaret didn't seem like someone who had chosen to stop working. There was a sadness there, a sense of loss that he recognized from his own difficult moments in life. "Isabella has been struggling with reading," David found himself saying, though he wasn't sure why he was sharing this with a stranger. "The school keeps sending notes home, and we've tried tutoring, but nothing seems to help. She's getting so frustrated that she doesn't even want to try anymore." Margaret looked down at Isabella with understanding eyes. "Reading can be tricky sometimes. Different children learn in different ways. What kinds of stories do you like, Isabella?" Isabella shrugged, scuffing her shoe against the sidewalk. "I don't know. They're all too hard. The words are too long." And I can't remember what happened at the beginning by the time I get to the end. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And when I was working at the school library, I met lots of children who felt exactly the same way. But do you know what I discovered? It wasn't that they couldn't read. It was just that nobody had found the right story for them yet. Really? Isabella asked, looking up with the first spark of hope David had seen in her eyes for weeks. Really? Margaret confirmed. Every reader is different. Some people love adventure stories, others prefer mysteries. Some like books with lots of pictures. Others enjoy stories about animals or magic or everyday kids doing extraordinary things. David watched this interaction with growing amazement. In just a few minutes, this woman had managed to do something that months of professional tutoring hadn't accomplished. She had given Isabella hope. Margaret, David said carefully, I know this might sound strange, but would you consider helping Isabella with her reading? I couldn't pay very much, but I'm desperate. She's such a bright kid, but she's starting to think she's not smart, and that breaks my heart. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For months she had been told she was too old, too outdated, no longer relevant, and here was this father asking for exactly what she had spent her entire career learning how to do. I would love to help, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. But I should tell you, I don't have fancy computers or the latest educational software. I just have books and patience and maybe some old-fashioned ideas about how children learn. David smiled for the first time in weeks. Honestly, Margaret, that sounds perfect. Isabella doesn't need fancy technology. She needs someone who believes she can succeed. They arranged for Isabella to come to Margaret's apartment the next day after school. As David and Isabella walked away, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. Someone needed her. Someone believed she still had something valuable to offer. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep, but for the first time since her retirement, it was excitement rather than despair keeping her awake. She spent hours going through her boxes of books, carefully selecting stories that might capture Isabella's imagination. She thought about reading levels and interests, about building confidence and creating positive associations with learning. She pulled out the Magic Treehouse series, remembering how those books had helped countless struggling readers in her library. She found some poetry books with short, engaging verses that wouldn't overwhelm a child who got lost in longer passages. She even discovered a book about a young girl who felt different from everyone else, but eventually found her own special talents, Margaret realized. She was doing what she had always done best, thinking about a specific child's needs and finding exactly the right stories to help them grow. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. The next afternoon, when Isabella knocked on her door with her school backpack and a tentative smile, Margaret welcomed her into the tiny apartment that suddenly felt full of possibility. She had transformed her small space into a cozy learning environment, with books arranged invitingly and a comfortable reading area set up near the window. What happened next was nothing short of magical, though it was the kind of everyday magic that happens when the right teacher meets the right student at exactly the right moment. Isabella's first lesson with Margaret lasted 2 hours, though it felt like minutes to both of them. Margaret began by simply talking with Isabella about her interests, her favorite colors, her pet hamster named Whiskers, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian someday. This wasn't wasted time, though. Isabella didn't know it yet. Margaret was doing what she had always done best, getting to know the whole child, not just the reading problem. Then Margaret pulled out a thin book about a girl who wanted to help sick animals. The words were simple, the sentences short, and there were plenty of pictures to support the text. But most importantly, it was about something Isabella cared about. Would you like to try reading this together? Margaret asked gently. We can take turns. He'll read one page, then I'll read the next. Isabella nodded nervously, but as she began to sound out the words about the young veterinarian, something wonderful happened. She didn't stumble over every syllable. She didn't get frustrated and give up. Instead, she found herself curious about what would happen next in the story. When Isabella finished the book, she looked up at Margaret with amazement. I read a whole book. You certainly did, Margaret replied with a proud smile. And you did it beautifully. David could hardly believe the change in his daughter when he picked her up that evening. Isabella was chattering excitedly about the story she had read, about Margaret's cozy apartment filled with books, and about how reading didn't feel scary anymore. "Can I go back tomorrow?" Isabella asked as they walked home. Within a week, Isabella was reading with confidence that amazed her teacher. Within 2 weeks, she was asking Margaret for harder books. By the end of the month, she was reading at grade level for the first time in her school career. Word spread quickly through David's network of working parents. At the school pickup line, other mothers and fathers began asking about Isabella's dramatic improvement. David proudly told them about Margaret, the retired librarian who had worked magic with his daughter. Soon, Margaret's phone was ringing with requests from other desperate parents. There was Carlos, a third grader, who was brilliant at math but couldn't seem to grasp reading. Margaret introduced him to books about numbers and patterns, stories where math heroes solved problems and saved the day. Within weeks, Carlos was devouring chapter books about young detectives who used mathematical clues to solve mysteries. Then came Aisha, shy second grader who was afraid to read aloud in class. Margaret created a safe space where mistakes were just part of learning, where Aisha could read to Margaret's old stuffed rabbit before building up the courage to read to a real person. Soon, Aisha was volunteering to read in class. Her confidence restored. Margaret's tiny apartment became an after-school haven. She pushed her furniture against the walls to create more space, hung colorful posters that celebrated reading, and filled every corner with carefully chosen books. The children called it Miss Margaret's Magic Library. Soon she had a waiting list of families hoping for her help. Each child was different. Margaret treated them as individuals. She remembered that quiet Tommy preferred graphic novels about superheroes, so she found educational comics about science and history. She knew that energetic Lily needed to move while learning, so they acted out stories and did reading games that involved jumping and dancing. For anxious Ben, who worried about making mistakes, Margaret created a special notebook where practice mistakes were celebrated as signs of learning. Margaret raised her rates as demand grew, finally earning enough to move to a larger apartment. But instead of keeping the extra money, she used it to buy more books, more supplies, and eventually to hire 2 assistants. Both were retired teachers who had faced situations similar to Margaret's, women whose experience had been dismissed as outdated despite their proven track records with children. Together, they created something unprecedented in their community. The Lighthouse Learning Center wasn't just a tutoring service. It was a place where children rediscovered their love of learning. Margaret's old-fashioned methods, patience, individual attention, and genuine care for each child proved more effective than any computer program or standardized curriculum. The center's success caught the attention of local media. A newspaper reporter came to write a story about the retired librarian who was helping struggling readers succeed. The article led to more families seeking Margaret's help, and soon she was booking months in advance. But the most satisfying moment came 8 months after Isabella's first visit. Margaret received a call from Clearwater Elementary School, her old workplace. The voice on the other end was familiar, though not friendly. "Margaret, this is Principal Johnson," the voice said stiffly. "I'm calling because we've noticed that several of our students who are struggling with reading have shown remarkable improvement recently. When we investigated, we discovered they're all attending your tutoring center." Margaret waited, saying nothing. "Our reading scores have actually dropped since we implemented our new digital program," the principal continued, her voice betraying a hint of desperation. "The school board is asking questions, and I was wondering if you might consider consulting with us on our reading curriculum." Margaret smiled, though Principal Johnson couldn't see it through the phone. "I appreciate you calling," she said gracefully, "but I'm afraid I'm quite busy with my current students. However, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent educational consultants who specialize in digital learning platforms." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat quietly in her bright, book-filled office, surrounded by the grateful drawings and thank-you notes from dozens of children whose lives she had touched. At 70 years old, she had learned that being thrown away by one group of people didn't mean you were worthless. Sometimes it just meant you hadn't found the right people yet. Her story had become proof that experience isn't obsolete, it's invaluable. That wisdom gained over decades of working with children can't be replaced by the newest technology or the latest educational trend. Most importantly, her journey showed that sometimes it takes just one person believing in you to help you remember your own worth. Margaret had been thrown into the scrapyard for being outdated, but David had seen her light when everyone else saw only shadows. And in saving Margaret, she had discovered she could save others too. The children who came to her center didn't just learn to read better, they learned that struggling doesn't mean failing, that everyone learns differently, and that with the right support, any child can succeed. The woman who had once felt invisible now shone brighter than ever. A lighthouse guiding young minds toward the joy of learning, proving that the best teachers aren't always the newest ones. They're the ones who truly understand that every child deserves to discover their own light.